Protagoras. Moving on to the next most famous of the sophists, Gorgias. Gorgias of Leontini. He's a bit younger than Protagoras, but they would have been competitors for students. When we were talking about the dialogue Protagoras, Gorgias was one of the people there listening in on the conversation. So, any questions about Protagoras before we move on to the next one?
Did he have any connection with like a protagonist?
Oh, I don't know if there's any etymology connection there. I would guess that that's just a coincidence. Thank you. Anything else? Ready for the next guy? All right, our next one. And he's going to take skepticism to a whole new level. So he's from Leontini. This right here is the island of Sicily, up close. Here's Syracuse. Leontini's right here, real close to Syracuse. Notice it's also close to Archragus. We remember who was big from Archragus? Oh, the ardent soul who leapt into Etna and was roasted whole.
Oh.
Because Etna's there in Sicily? Empedocles.
He eventually completed his immortal.
Yeah, it was Empedocles. Empedocles, Aristotle had a name for Empedocles. The father of dialectic was Zeno. What was Empedocles?
No change.
He's the father of rhetoric.
Oh, that's right.
He's a four elements guy.
Yeah.
But, yeah, he had this other mystical side to him. He's kind of like Pythagoras. But he was, by Aristotle, he was classified as the father of rhetoric. And he was the last one to still use this very poetical style in arguing for his philosophies. And so Gorgias is growing up there on Sicily, close to where Empedocles was, and he was a student of Empedocles. So I can already give you a sense for where he's getting his rhetoric training. Okay, so student of Empedocles, he's going to focus very much on teaching this art of persuasion, teaching rhetoric, and he's going to follow Protagoras in his skepticism, and he's going to take it to a whole new level. Now, in a dispute between his native city and Syracuse, remember they were right next to each other, he traveled to Athens in 427 BC as an embassy, winning Athens to his side over the representative from Syracuse. Remember, Athens is spreading their influence at this time, so if two city-states under Athens' influence have a dispute with each other, they don't get to work it out amongst themselves. They send their emissaries to Athens. Athens will tell them who's right and who's wrong, and they have to accept Athens' judgment. So, Gorgias was one representing his city. Someone from Syracuse is representing their city over some dispute over like who gets control over some stream or something like that. And Gorgias ends up winning a pretty famous victory here. So this, along with many other similar victories, won him fame as a great rhetorician. It's extremely difficult to know Gorgias' actual positions on anything. Aristotle claims that Gorgias recommended responding to seriousness with jest and to jest with seriousness. And so he's a bit sarcastic, I guess you would say, in a bunch of his conversations. He's famous for allowing his audiences to submit anonymous questions, each of which he would promise he would answer. So he was one of these, you remember Protagoras making fun of this type of sophist a little bit, who wants you to be more of a generalist and know about everything. And so he thought he could answer questions on pretty much anything that was not the time. Now, he wrote a textbook on rhetoric, composed many speeches on many topics for his students to memorize and practice. Right? That's the way you do it. You come up with speeches that on a bunch of different topics that will eventually come up in whatever conversations, and then when that one topic comes up and you have the right spot to insert that speech, you're just ready to go, ready to fire, and give that speech that you've rehearsed 100 times. Many refer to Gorgias as the Nihilist. He's going to be the first nihilist that we have. Nihilism being the view that all values are baseless. Nihilistic, nothing means anything, and that nothing can be known or communicated. Nihilistic view. Nothing means anything, nothing can really be known, nothing really matters. Nihilism. Now, he also wrote a textbook on nature, telling us all about nature, and it was titled On Non-Being, or On Nature. Because he's going to argue that there is no nature. So he's putting in with non-being. Take you through his argument here. So, Gorgias on this textbook, and you're going to see how he takes skepticism to a whole new level after Protagoras. So he's got this textbook. In particular, his book sets out to prove three things. Number one, nothing exists. Number two, if anything exists, it's incomprehensible. You can't know it. Number 3, if it's comprehensible, it's incommunicable. There's nothing. Even if there is something, you can't know about it. Even if you could know about it, no sense talking about it, because you can't communicate about it. And he wrote a whole book communicating this to us. How kind. No, some say he argued these things just to prove that he could argue anything, no matter how absurd, but that is not the way his contemporaries viewed these arguments, and that is not the way that his arguments are later used. So, some people like to say, he was never serious. Whether he was serious or not, later thinkers come to think these things, and come to start using these arguments. So, the standard view is, no, he was serious about these things. It's hard to think that he would write out a full textbook as a joke. But maybe he did. Who knows? So, let's go through his arguments here. So, the proof consists in showing that neither being nor non-being can exist. So, we're arguing that nothing can exist. How are we going to prove nothing can exist? We're going to prove that neither being nor non-being can exist. We have to prove being can exist and non-being can exist. Remember, you got the atomists now who are saying there's atoms in the void. There's being and non-being. So you argue, no, there's nothing. How does that argument go? If non-being existed, very Parmenidean, then non-being would have being, which is a contradiction. Therefore, non-being does not exist. Okay, so we proved there can't be non-being. Now what about being? We got to prove that there's no such thing as being. To show that being does not exist, Gorgias shows that it is not eternal, nor created. So if it doesn't exist forever, and it never came into existence, then it can't exist. You see the logic there? Yeah. It wasn't there forever. Okay, so when was it created? It wasn't. Okay, then it can't exist. He's also going to show that it can't be one, and it can't be many. So if there's being, what is it? Is it one or is it many? Well, it's neither. Then what is it? Well, it doesn't exist. So that's the 2 ways he's going to come at this. Therefore, it does not exist. So I need to show you each of those 4 arguments. So I'm going to walk you through proving it's not eternal, then that it's not created, then that's not one, then that's not many. And that will cover it. You see a big picture of how we're going to cover it? Okay. So, let's get started. If something exists, it must have a position. Otherwise, it's nowhere. And does something that's nowhere exist? No, right? So if something exists, it must have a position. If it has, these aren't going to be impressive arguments, by the way, if you're expecting that. If it has a position, it must have a position inside some container. You got to be able to give it some sort of coordinates. Say, go this far from that, da, da, da. There must be some containing space from which you can talk about where something's positioned. So if it exists, it has a position. If it has a position, it must have a position inside some container, some space that contains it. If it exists in a container, it must be bounded, because you can fit in a container. If it's bounded, it has a beginning.
Yeah, well, that's
Why does it?
If it's bounded, so if I can put something in a container, it can't go on to infinity. It's bounded, right?
Why can't the container go on to
I don't know. Because it's a container. If it's infinite, it's indefinite, and it's not a container anymore. That's how.
It's still a center, so you can still measure stuff.
Maybe. The center of infinity, that's a hard one to say. Okay. Let's see. Trying to remake this make sense. Hard to do. Okay. If something exists, it must have a position. If it has a position, it must have a position inside some container. If it's in a container, it must be bounded. So if I can contain it, it must have bounds on it. Otherwise, it can't be contained. Right? That's what it means to be unbounded. You can't be contained. Now, if you're bounded, that means you start somewhere and end somewhere. You have a beginning. Okay. So ultimately, if something exists, it has a beginning. Now we're going to use a contrapositive of that. If it doesn't have a beginning, it must not exist. Okay. So now, if being is eternal, it has no beginning. Right? And so it's boundless. And so it has no container. and so has no position, and so does not exist. And so if it's eternal, it can't exist. Therefore, being can't be eternal. Because it being eternal implies it doesn't exist.
So that's kind of where I think he falls out.
Therefore, being is not eternal. Okay, so we covered that one. You kind of see the logic he's using?
Kind
It's
of.
not very good.
Well, kind of as good as we're going to get. Yeah. Want you to, what's the right way to say it? Have intuition for the argument he's going for there. Feel like you can understand what he's trying to say. Okay, so we've done away with being can't be eternal. Now let's show that it can't be created. This is going to be very Parmenidean. If being is created, then there must have been a time before being existed. Right? If I created you, then I created you at some time. And so there must have been a time before you were created.
Yeah, it goes on forever and ever and ever.
Well, it doesn't matter. The point is that there was a time before being existed.
Why?
If being was created,
Yeah.
then there must have been a time before being existed. Because I created you at this time, so at the previous second, you weren't there. Okay. Since there was no being before this time, then what existed must have been non-being.
It didn't exist.
Being didn't exist. So whatever existed wasn't being.
But
So it's not being or non-being.
but nothing. What does it mean by then what existed? Nothing existed.
Exactly. Not being existed. I say again. If being is created, then there must have been a time before being existed. So what was there? Well, it wasn't being. So whatever there was wasn't being.
There wasn't.
It was not being.
But there wasn't anything.
Was there being? No. So there was not being. Not being and non-being are the same thing for these Greeks. They switch back and forth between those two things. What do we mean by non-being? Not being. So there was non-being before being. And we've already shown you can't have non-being existing.
Yes. What's the guy who did not being?
Well, it goes all the way back, but this is largely the way Protagoras argued.
Yeah.
Not
Sounds familiar.
Parmenides, thank you. So, since there was no being before this time, then what existed must have been non-being. Then non-being would have being, which is a contradiction. Therefore, being is not created. Alright, so we get that can't be eternal, and we get that can't be created. Let's move on to the next one. If being is one, it has size. Right? Everything has its size.
What does it mean by one?
You just have a piece of it. There it is. So if being is one, it has size. If it has size, it must have magnitude. Doesn't make sense to talk about size without magnitude, right? If it has some size, that size has some magnitude, some number you can assign to it, however big it is. Any magnitude is infinitely divisible. So I could take that one, since it has magnitude, I could divide it up into pieces and make it many. Anything divisible is many. So if being is one, it is many, which is impossible. So a being can't be one, otherwise it's many. Contradiction. Alright, what about, can it be many? Well, if being is many, it's many ones, right? That's what it means. You have some here, some there, here's a being, here's a being. If it's many, then you at least have one. And we already showed you can't have one. That was a previous argument.
Divide it up forever.
Huh?
Can't you just divide it up forever? Like, maybe you could just get to a place where there's no one. You just keep on dividing forever and ever.
You're overthinking the argument. So you say that being is many,
Yeah.
so I can grab a piece of being, which is at least one.
No.
No?
Why? Why would it be at least one?
Because then I didn't grab anything. You're overthinking it. It's often going to come down to some sort of wordplay with it. So if you grab some being, it's at least one. And we already showed that you can't have a one. I mean, you're going to say it's more than one. Well, then it's at least one, though. And we can't have a one. We already proved that. Because if you have a one, you have a many. And that's a contradiction. And so, it can't be infinite, or it can't be eternal, it can't be created, it can't be one, and it can't be many.
So it doesn't exist.
So it isn't. It's non-existence. That's all that there is. So we have shown that non-being cannot exist. That's what we did first. And now we have also shown that being cannot be eternal, nor created, nor one, nor many. Since it is neither eternal nor created, it cannot exist. Right? You have to be one of those two. You either have to be created or eternal. Otherwise, you don't exist. And then since it's neither one nor many, it cannot exist. You have to be one of those two. If you exist, you either exist as one or more than one. But both of those are impossible. So it can't exist. Therefore, being cannot exist. Since non-being does not exist, and since being does not exist, then nothing exists.
Is it nothing the same as not being?
Not anymore.
Okay.
Because the atomists introduced this distinction. The void is what they mean by non-being. So, covering his bases there. If we're going to make a distinction between non-being and nothing, I'm going to prove that you can't have non-being. If you already accept that non-being is nothing, well, that's what he's claiming. Nothing exists. Very Heraclitean there, right?
Yeah.
You can also see why we often look at Heraclitus as being the first one to start going down that skeptic route. Okay. Next. So we already proved that nothing exists. Now we could have made a mistake. It's not likely, but maybe we did. But even if anything exists, it's incomprehensible. We can't know it. How do we prove that? So if something is comprehensible, then it is a concept of the mind, right? If you comprehend it, it must somehow exist as a concept in your mind, right? If something is not a concept of the mind, then it is incomprehensible. It's just contrapositive of that. If this implies this, then not this implies not this. Good so far? Okay. So, if the concepts of the mind are not realities, then reality is incomprehensible. You follow that? Look, if something is not a concept of the mind, it's incomprehensible. So if realities are not concepts of the mind, then they're incomprehensible. You've already agreed to these things, right? This second sentence is just a special case of the previous sentence. We're just replacing that something with realities.
This guy's a sophist, right?
Yes, he is very much a sophist. The sophists are the ones who become skeptics, and they start skepticism, and ultimately takes over Plato's academy. But we'll get Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, which are good, sane people. Okay, so we've covered this implication. Now let's jump into it. Those faculties which are about reality present real things to us. Faculties are going to be like thought, sight, hearing, smell, whatever. Those faculties which are about reality present real things to us. Things seen are the objects of sight, and things heard are the objects of hearing. We accept as real the things heard and not seen, and we accept as real the things seen but not heard. Right? If I didn't see you walk in, but I heard you talk, I accept that you're there. So I accept that you're real if I can only hear you and can't see you. Similarly, if a loud bang went off and I was deaf for a while, and I saw you, I accept you as real even though I can't hear you. Okay? So these faculties, sight and hearing, they present realities to us. And we accept that they present realities to us even when you can't corroborate them with other senses.
Isn't that not the way sophists think?
This is exactly the way sophists think.
I thought they thought that nothing is real.
We already covered that. Now we're arguing even if there is something real, you can't know it. So we've already covered nothing's real. Now, right, we're using realities here, but he's saying even if there are realities, it's unknowable. So we've already covered there is no reality, but even if there is, it's unknowable. So we're taking as a premise, okay, maybe there is reality. And going from there. Okay, good. Okay, now, so we accept as real the things heard and not seen, and we accept as real the things seen but not heard. If thought was about objects of reality, then we should be able to accept as real the objects of thought that are not seen or heard. Otherwise, it's not about reality. It's the way our other senses are, our other faculties. However, we can think about non-realities. The ones he gives is a chariot on water. We can think about a purple elephant in the middle of the sun. I can't hear it. I can't feel it. I can't smell it, I can't taste it, I can't see it, but I can think it. And if thought was about realities, wouldn't that be enough to validate that it's real? Right? If I only see something, I accept it as real. If my only faculty is sight telling me about an object, I accept it as real. If my only faculty is hearing telling me about an object, I know that's real. Yeah, if my only faculty is thought telling me about an object, I say, no, that doesn't make it real. That's what he's saying. Then thought is not about objects of reality. And so the concepts of the mind are not realities. And using this implication up here, therefore, reality is incomprehensible.
The bottom one makes sense.
So remember we said up here, so if the concepts of the mind are not realities, then reality is incomprehensible. Then we prove that the concepts of the mind are not realities. Therefore, reality is incomprehensible. Can't know anything about it. Huh. There it is. You guys saw that one? Ready for the next one? Okay. Now, it's possible we may have made a mistake in that proof. However slightly. So even if there is a reality, and even if it is comprehensible, it's incommunicable. We can't talk about it. And so there's no sense even trying to. And so it's a waste of time to even converse about these things. Focus on rhetoric. Focus on what's useful for you now. Anyways, let's see how he says it's incommunicable. This one's the hardest one to follow. Huh?
Isn't this talking about everything?
So we've been covering 3 pieces of his argument. So take you from the top again. So his book claimed 3 things.
Yes.
1, nothing exists. Even if something existed, it's incomprehensible. Even if it was comprehensible, it's incommunicable.
So you're saying everything is communicable.
No, he's saying nothing exists.
After that.
Even if I made a mistake here and something does exist, it's incomprehensible.
So it's still not.
Even if I made a mistake here and it is comprehensible, it's incommunicable. So there's no point talking about these things.
He says while he's talking about
Huh?
it. He says while he's talking about it.
Yes. It's very hard to have a consistent skeptic position. The skeptics are always instantly undermining themselves. You say, there's no objective truth. Are you saying that's objectively true, or is that just true for you?
Could you remind me of rhetoric means?
Rhetoric, so rhetoric is studying persuasion.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I keep going back and forth between those 2 terms. Should have been better about that. Okay, oops, way past it.
Next one.
Next one. All right, so the last step here. So even if there is a reality, and even if it is comprehensible, it's at the very least incommunicable. Can't talk about it. I just wanted to get a sense for what he's saying here. The things which exist are perceptible and known through our percepts. You can hear them, you can see them, you can touch them, you can smell them, you can feel them, right? The objects of sight are perceived by sight, the objects of hearing by hearing. The sense perceptions cannot communicate with each other. And so I cannot come to understand objects of sight by hearing, nor objects of hearing by sight. I can never smell color, right? I can never see sound. I can never hear color, maybe was a better example. Our senses, each of our sensory apparatuses can only communicate to us one type of sense, and they can't communicate with each other. I can't get hearing data coming in through both my eyes and my ears. Only my ears can hear, only my eyes can see, etc. So that's what he's saying there. So I'll say that one more time. The sense perceptions cannot communicate with each other, and so I cannot come to understand objects of sight by hearing, nor objects of hearing by sight. Think you got it so far? Okay. Humans communicate via speech. And speech is not the same thing, and speech is not the same thing as the things that exist, perceptible objects. When I tell you about my dog, does that make you see my dog? Hear my dog? Smell my dog? Taste my dog? Feel my dog? So speech cannot communicate precepts. Not precepts, percepts, sorry. Yeah, listen to this one. So remember, at the top, the things which exist are perceptible and known through the percepts. That's how you know something. You see it, touch it, smell it, taste it, hear it. When I talk to you about something, I'm just giving you speech. I'm not giving you any perceptions of the object itself. So my speech isn't making you know the object itself.
But we can visualize it again.
Well, maybe. But I tell you that my pet dog is 29 feet long. Does that make it so? Are you coming to know reality now that I tell you about my dog?
Here we go.
Right?
Yeah.
She's 29 feet long. She's got the tail of an elephant. She's got a weird elephant trunk coming right out the center of her back. And she can talk, but only German. Right. You're not coming to know anything about my dog. And maybe I happen to tell you some things that were from the perceptions I had of the dog, but there's no way for you to know that. So I'm not giving you that perceptual data. The only way for you to come to know my dog is to come see her for yourself. So humans communicate via speech, and speech is not the same thing as the things that exist, the perceptible objects. Just as that which is seen cannot be heard, so that which is speech cannot be equated with perceptible things. Speech can only give you the objects of speech, just as sight can only give you the objects of sight. Then, when we talk, we communicate not the things which exist, but only speech. All speech is about speech. Talk is just talk. Nothing more. And just as sight cannot communicate any information about sound, so too speech cannot communicate any information about existence. Therefore, even if we could comprehend reality, we could not communicate about it.
This is kind of insightful because we really, when we hear something, we're only relating it to our own experiences and not to what they're actually saying. That's interesting. It's interesting.
Right, so they could occasionally have useful insights, but their conclusions are utterly asinine. Back to our basic premise. If something seems like it's asinine, it most likely is. And just because you can't figure out what's wrong with the argument does not mean you should accept the argument. Now, a bunch of these arguments, you can probably figure out what's wrong.
Yeah.
But, no, same thing. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Do skeptics get any better than this?
Oh, yes. And by better, I mean much worse.
Like, do their arguments make more sense?
They become far more consistent with themselves. So, you might ask a skeptic, so he says nothing exists. You would go to a skeptic says nothing exists. And they say, well, do you know that nothing exists? They say, no, well, it's highly probable that nothing exists. You say, well, do you know it's highly probable that nothing exists? And they say, no, well, it's highly probable that nothing exists. And you say, well, do you know that? You say, well, no, it's just highly probable that nothing exists. And there was a joke in Roman times that whenever you're dealing with a skeptic, you just keep asking them, and they end up over in a corner just saying to themselves, it's highly probable that it's highly probable. And so that's how you deal with the skeptics, who are more consistent.
So you're saying they kind of refined their philosophy?
Yeah, in a sense, he's claiming to know that nothing exists.
Doesn't make any sense.
Right. So they're not going to be near as consistent with themselves. It's kind of like when we were covering Democritus. You know, he had his metaphysics and then his ethics, and the two were completely incoherent with each other. Because at his time, I mean, he just gets a very standard Greek ethic at the time, and his metaphysics is wherever his metaphysics is. So they become more consistent as time, and it's better to be inconsistently right than to be consistently wrong, and they just become more consistently wrong.
So like, start with a good, right foundation.
Well, not that you start with a good, right foundation, but that you have some common sense, and you just can't throw it all out the window altogether.
Yeah.
So you're saying is like, try to come to what the truth is based off of your actual experience, and rather than come up with some logical conclusion that has nothing to do with reality, and then build off that because it makes sense logically.
Right. Kind of, yeah. The analogy I usually give this analogy when I'm talking about, modernists, not Rene Descartes, John Locke. So John Locke is my favorite of the modern philosophers, and the reason I like him is because he's the only one willing to be inconsistent. The rest of them decide that their philosophy has to be perfectly consistent, and so they end up just coming up with all this nonsense. Like David Hume thought that we were in some big imaginary space, and everything just existed in his imagination. And there's a story going that he convinced himself so hard that everything was his imagination, as there was a rock in the road he refused to move, thinking that doesn't really exist. And he stubbed his toe nice and hard. And reality reasserted itself. And it gets him thinking, and he goes back home and thinks, maybe my philosophy's wrong. And he looks at his philosophy and says, I can't see the mistake. It must be right.
His experience must be
Did you feel the pain?
mistaken.
Right. And so the analogy I give is, it's like they did this, there's this road ahead of them. And they do this super careful calculation early on that tells them exactly how the road should go. And maybe he says the road is perfectly this way, and it's off just a very, very slight degree. It doesn't matter how far down the road you go. If you're barely off, eventually you get way off the road. And he sees that he's way off the road and nothing makes sense. He goes back and looks at his calculations. I can't see a mistake. This must be the road. John Locke has enough sense to, when he goes off the road, he says, no, I'm off the road. This doesn't make sense. Let's go back. And even though he's not sticking with his initial calculation, at least he spends a lot of time on the road. That's what I mean by it's better to be inconsistently right than consistently wrong.
Sometimes your perception does deceive you and your instruments.
Kind of. Should we talk about this for a second?
No.
No. Your senses, your sensory data tells you exactly how it is. Let's say you're colorblind. And so when you see things, you're not seeing a different color. What is your sensory data telling you? You have a defunct eyeball. That's what it's telling you. It's telling you about the actual apparatus that you're using. If you're wearing glasses and you can only see with glasses and there's a big scratch on the lens and so you see this line everywhere, it's not that that line is in any way integrated with reality. It's telling you exactly how it is. There's a scratch on your lens. That's what it is. And yeah, you see it different than other people. That's because you're using a different thing. And so it's still communicating to you about reality, but your sensory apparatus is part of reality. And so your senses don't lie to you. Your senses don't make judgments. Your mind makes judgments based off of the sensory data that your senses take in. So you take in data, then you make judgments. So your senses, they can't lie to you. My finger doesn't know anything. It's my mind that makes judgments. My finger just communicates the senses to me. And if I stop feeling something like this, I should probably go to the hospital. My finger's telling me that there's something wrong.
Yeah, but we're not talking about necessarily senses. We're talking about judgments about our senses and how we should rely on those.
Well, their argument is that the sensory data is conflicting for the same people. The same scenario giving you different results, but it's never actually giving you different results. If I stick my hand in the hot water, what's happening? Heat is flowing into my hand. Then I stick it in the warm temperature, heat is flowing out of my hand. And that's exactly what I feel, heat flowing out of my hand. Someone who goes from the cold to the warm, they're feeling heat flowing to their hand. And they're feeling it exactly as it is. And in one scenario, heat's flowing one way, and so it's not about the same experience, two completely different outcomes. No, it's two completely different experiences. We didn't do the same things.
I don't know if you're understanding what I'm saying.
No.
I'm just saying that their approach in some cases does work. where you might realize, you might look around and say, hey, I'm off the road, but you actually were on the road, and your just perception was mistaken. Your judgment of your senses.
judgment is wrong.
You can use your perceptions to come to false judgments.
Yes.
And
Yes,
that's what I'm saying.
that's true.
Is that you could go back to your philosophy and be like, oh, based off of my philosophy, I am on the road, and actually be on the road, even though your perceptions and your judgments of your perceptions.
But they're not nearly making that distinction. They are saying your senses lie to you, which you already see the problem in the thinking. Your senses don't say anything. You come to a false conclusion based on the sensory data. That's a whole different statement. A kid might actually believe if I stick a stick in water and they see it bend, that the stick, I actually bend it in water. I say, look, I can bend this stick. See? And then pull it back up. Straighten it, bend it. Let's see if you can. The kid tries, doesn't work. They can't bend the stick.
Yeah.
It was easy for me.
So you go back to your
And so they're seeing Snell's law in action. They don't understand Snell's law, but they're being given the data of reality as it actually is.
Yeah.
And so
you go back to your let's say philosophy of physics and how light works, and you understand how it's bending the light, and that explains it. And
Right.
that sometimes is counterintuitive to our common sense.
it is physics is often very counterintuitive. But we come to something that we call Snell's law, which we all agree is objective and absolute.
Okay. What law?
It's called Snell's law, the way that light bends in arm. Okay.
Oh, gotcha.
Just a name for it. But the point is, some law of physics we then come to, which we accept as objective and absolute. The very thing that skeptics are arguing does not exist. You can't have it. So it's in no way coherent with the scientific view.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not saying it is, but okay.
I mean, it can be interesting to consider these things. You can have an epiphany, you can get some intuition, blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, it's garbage philosophy. However you want to twist it. You might get some value out of it, but doesn't change what it is. Okay, bit of a detour there. I think we finished this, right?
I did.
Okay. Any other questions on Gorgias?
Did you have a picture?
Not a very good one.
He wants to know if he's gorgeous.
That's as good looking as I get. I mean, if that's not gorgeous,
Probably was.
I don't know who is.
Does his name have any connection with the word?
I have no idea. But that brings us to Prodicus, the one who studies etymology. But we'll cover him next time. So we'll cover the next two next time. It'll be much quicker. Just so you know, for Thrasymachus, so I told you the next two dialogues that we're going to be covering a lot of is the Apology, and then we're going to cover the Republic by Plato. This one's short, probably less than an hour read. This one is a big one. We're going to cover the start of this, not in covering Prodicus, but in covering Thrasymachus, the next one. Because it's in the first book of the Republic that a lot of the information about him comes up. Then we'll do the Apology to cover Socrates, and then we'll go back to the Republic to cover a lot of Plato's ideas. And this is like, if you want to get a feel for Plato, this is a work that pretty much covers his metaphysics, epistemology, everything. And so it's used as his like most standard work for getting a feel for what it is, getting a feel for Plato's philosophy. So that's a standard work he used. Any other questions? All right, cool. We'll pick it up there next time.